Hello, welcome to Community in Crisis. My name is Wayne Johnson. I'm an attorney who practices law in Oakland, California. My co-host is Dr. Stephen Nur Ahmed. Today we have a very exciting and impressive guest who's been practicing law in various parts of the country for over 50 years. His name is Mr. Howard Moore Jr.
Pleased to meet you. Pleased to be here.
Okay. Mr. Moore, can you tell us why you decided to go into law?
I heard Thurgood Marshall speak when I was a sophomore in college at Morehouse, and I heard him speak at an NAACP event. And I was so impressed with the way he spoke, not with what he said, because I don't remember what he said, but I do remember the manner in which he spoke. And I decided that in order to be like him, and I wanted to be like him, I had to become a lawyer. So when I went home that evening, I went and asked my mother, and told my mother that I wanted to become a lawyer. And she said to me, she says, "Howard, what does it take to become a lawyer?" And I replied, "I don't know." And she told me to go over to Morehouse the next day and speak to Dean Brazil and find out.
Hold up a second, Mr. Moore. Now, who is Dean Brazil?
He was the dean of Morehouse College.
Okay, now, how were you familiar with him?
From being a student at Morehouse and from occasionally walking with him at lunchtime during the summer when he would come back from lunch to his office, and he would talk to me about the sleeping car porters, because he wrote his dissertation on the sleeping car porters.
Okay, well, go ahead. Tell us more about that.
And anyway, I got a chance to go into Dean Brazil's office without prearrangement, and I told him, I said, "Dean Brazil, I decided I want to go to law school." And he looked me dead in the eye, and he scratched his mustache, and he said to me, "Mr. Moore, you have to pull up on your record." That was like pouring salt on an open wound. I thanked Dean Brazil for letting me come in, and I left. And years later, I thought about that. And I came to the conclusion that Dean Brazil gave me the advice that I needed, because the only thing that was within my control that would determine whether or not I would ever go to law school is what record I created when I was in college.
Okay. Now, so you decided to move on and go to college from the law school, I mean.
Yeah.
And you went to law school. Where'd you go to law school?
Boston University.
Okay. And what years are we talking about?
Well, I graduated from college in 1954, but I was inducted into armed services. I served my 2 years, and after I was separated from the Army and discharged, I started law school in 1957. I graduated in 1960.
Well, Mr. Moore, did you serve overseas? Was this during the Korean War?
Well, there was cessation of hostility.
I see.
And I didn't go overseas. As a matter of fact, I didn't get out of the South. I had a tremendous experience in the South. I went from Atlanta, Georgia, to Fort Jackson, South Carolina. From Fort Jackson, South Carolina, I went to Fort Benning, Georgia. From Fort Benning, Georgia, I went to Walters Air Force Base in Mineral Wells, Texas. That's 46 miles from Fort Worth. And from Mineral Wells, Texas, I went to England Air Force Base in Alexandria, Louisiana.
Can you give us a description of the climate as far as race relations in the South at that time?
Well, they were improving, but slowly, very, very slowly. Segregation, Jim Crow was in vogue. That was the relationship between the races at that time. And there was a lot of agitation by the NAACP primarily. And of course, in 1955, 1960, 1956, there was the Montgomery bus boycott, which was the biggest organized activity in my lifetime and probably the lifetime of many African Americans, because it persisted for close to a year before the Supreme Court declared that segregation on the public buses of Montgomery was illegal. The other big activity at that time was the agitation and the reaction to the murder of Emmett Till, the 14-year-old African American boy who had come down from Chicago to visit with his grandparents in Mississippi, and allegedly whistled at a white woman, and for that act he was kidnapped and then beaten and thrown in a river. And his mother, when she had his funeral services conducted, didn't close the casket, but left the casket open so that people could see how badly he'd been beaten in his disfigured body. And photographs and pictures of that appeared in Jet magazine and Ebony magazine.
Mr. Moore, I'd like to go back just one step and ask you what the strategy of the bus boycott was. What was the intent? What did the activists think that they could achieve such that it would give them leverage?
Well, they knew that by not patronizing the bus, withholding their monies, that the bus company might come around because it's very difficult to maintain a bus system if you don't have people actively riding the buses. And the majority of the people in the city of Montgomery who used the bus at that time were African Americans. So they felt that the withholding of their economic power by not riding the bus would bring the bus around to have a change in their modality with respect to seating. Black people would sometimes have to pay up front but go to the side to get on the bus. If blacks were on the bus and then a white person got on the bus, and the black would have to give up his or her seat to the white person, or move to the back just because the white person didn't feel comfortable with the black person standing in proximity to them.
Let me ask you this question, just to go back a little bit. You mentioned something about Thurgood Marshall. Was this before the speech that you went to when you heard him speak? Was that before the Brown versus the Board of Education case?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
Yeah. The Brown was in May 17, 1954, and this was in 1952. I graduated from college in 54, so I know it was earlier than that.
Okay. Now, over the years, you've had the opportunity to represent quite a few individuals. Is that not correct?
Oh, yes.
Now, tell us who some of the primary figures were.
Well, if you want some, I represented everyone who was somebody in the civil rights movement, from Dr. King to H.Rap Brown to Stokely Carmichael to Julian Bond to people, Cleveland Sellers, people whose name you've never heard of. I represented them.
Can you tell us what one of the most interesting cases you've ever worked on?
Well, one of the most interesting cases I ever worked on, and the most challenging case, is probably one of the least known cases. I had been practicing law for approximately 2 years. And I went into my office one afternoon and there was a letter on my desk. And I opened the letter and the letter said, "Dear Mr. Moore, please help me. They're going to kill me tomorrow in the electric chair. Please help me. Yours in Christ, Ernest Whippler." It was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The execution was scheduled for the next morning. I read the letter I don't know how many times because I didn't want to believe it. I thought it was an April Fool's joke. And I had no idea about defending somebody who was sentenced to death. But anyway, I became involved in the case, and I was able to put together overnight a petition for the governor to appoint a sanity commission. And I took it to the governor's office the next day, and the governor appointed the sanity commission and stayed the execution for approximately 60 days. And then I went to visit Ernest Whippler, who was the inmate who had written me. And he was on the 5th floor of the Georgia State Prison in Reidsville, Georgia. And when you get up to the 5th floor at that time, as soon as you walk out of the elevator, there's the electric chair in the middle, exact middle of the room, painted white as though it's laughing at you. And I went over to Whippler's cell and we began to talk. And as we were talking, I heard the sound of a bird chirping. And I looked beyond Whippler, and I saw that there was a cage that had been fashioned from cigarette packages. And a swing had been made inside the cage, also from cigarette packages. And on that swing, there was a tiny bird, a wren or a sparrow or something of that sort. And it was so, to me, it was so incongruent that a condemned man would be caring for another living thing, the bird, that I just got, I was almost dismayed, and I couldn't really carry on the conversation I had intended to carry on. But in any event, I was successful in filing a petition for habeas corpus. We went up to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeal. Eventually, his conviction was overturned. Georgia was required to pass legislation to change its post-conviction proceedings. And in 1984, Whippler was placed on parole. And in 1988, he was released from parole. I don't know why he picked me, why he wrote me. I wasn't famous, I wasn't experienced, and I certainly didn't solicit the letter.
Impressive. Now, you say you represented Angela Davis.
Yes.
Can you tell us what some of the challenges were in that case?
Oh, everything was a challenge in that case. Initially getting involved in the case, one of the challenges is to relocate to California, which I was required to do.
What was she charged with?
She was charged with murder, kidnap, and conspiracy.
In relation to?
In relationship to the rebellion on August 7th, 1970 in Marin County, when a young person by the name of Johnson Jackson went into the courtroom and armed some inmates who were conducting a trial there. And they took from the courtroom a judge, a district attorney, and several jurors, a couple of witnesses, and themselves. And when they got outside and began to drive away, they were met with a hail of bullets. Jackson was killed. Two of the inmates were killed. The judge was killed. The district attorney was permanently wounded and injured. And one of the jurors was shot in the arm and injured.
How was Jonathan Jackson at this time?
He was 17 years old at the time. Yeah.
Now, were there some particular challenges to representing Angela Davis because of her beliefs?
Oh, yes. It seems as though people generally felt that she had a right to take the positions that they believed she had taken because she was African American, and perhaps even because she was an African American woman.
What was her position? What was her ideology?
Well, you're asking a big question. With respect to the incident involved, she believed that prisoners in California weren't treated properly.
I see.
And that there should be a more humane, different treatment of prisoners, and that prisoners should have an opportunity to have a fair trial, not trumped up trials, and not be kept in prison forever for relatively minor offenses. George Jackson, who was supposedly one of the objects of the events of August 7th, had been in prison since he was about 16 or 19 years of age for a $70 robbery. That she felt that type of thing was wrong. But she was also a member of the Communist Party. And with respect to her membership in the Communist Party, the antagonism against her was much higher than it was because she was African American. We did public opinion polling, and we never, ever got her negatives down below at least 60% because of her membership in the Communist Party.
Now, would you believe that black communists were treated better or worse than white communists in that era?
Black communists were treated worse when they were in prison. Henry Winston, who was became chairman of the Communist Party, they wouldn't allow him to have medical care that would have saved his eyesight. Other African Americans who were communists were put in maximum security prisons like Leavenworth in Atlanta because of their beliefs. There was a definite idea that to treat African Americans who were communists more severe than whites who were communists, but all of them were treated pretty roughly.
Well, how did they stand in relation to the African American community? Were they treated as poorly, or was the treatment qualitatively better?
Well, that's a big question with respect to the African American community, because in the African American community, you have everything. You have people who are highly invested in the system as it is. You have people who are not as highly invested in the system as it is. And you have people who want to change that system. And most everyone wanted to change that system. But what is the extent of changing the system? Do you replace the system with an entirely different system? Do you make gradational changes of sort that lets you into the system? In other words, integrate you into the system. But the system of capitalism remains unchanged. So I don't know whether that answers your question or not, but
Well, I guess I was trying to understand whether the African American community was more tolerant, more receptive to at least having an open mind.
Some elements of the African American community were.
I see.
Without a doubt, there's absolutely no question about that. Okay. And there were many organizations throughout the South and elsewhere in the country that were heavily influenced by African Americans. By the communists, I should say. You take the Scottsboro Boys case. I mean, the Communist Party was highly influential in that case, and it led to some fundamental changes in criminal process.
And they were just exonerated, weren't they?
They were eventually exonerated.
Yeah.
George Wallace pardoned the last Scottsboro boy in 1976.
Yes.
Let me ask you this question: why was it Angela Davis chose you of all the attorneys in the United States?
Well, I guess you have to ask her. I met her in New York. She was in prison. And I didn't go to prison to be her attorney. That was the furthest thing from my mind. But we had a very nice conversation. And she liked me, and I was asked to represent her.
This is after she was already charged?
Yes, yes.
Okay, now,
well, I don't know if she'd been formally indicted at that time or not, but she certainly was wanted. Okay.
She was a suspect in the case at that time.
At least that. Yeah.
Okay. Now let me ask you this: you weren't a member of the California bar at that time, is that correct? So, what were the steps that you had to go through to begin to represent her?
Well, you have to have someone who is a member of the bar move your admission for the purposes of that case only, what they call pro hac vici. And someone did do that, and I was admitted.
As you represented Dr. Davis, was she able to handle the stress and the pressure of the judicial process as the proceedings went forward?
Oh, yeah, she handled the process. It took a toll on her, but she definitely handled the process. I mean, she continued to write. She published. She published a book called If They Come in the Morning, which was a collection of essays with a contribution from her. She published another book while she was in prison, Angela Speaks, and the book was published around the world. Both books were published around the world in various languages. She continued to issue speeches and messages from prison and conduct interviews while she was in prison. And as a matter of fact, she participated in her own defense. She made the opening statement in her case.
Impressive. Tell us some of the unique things that you did in the Angela Davis case.
Well, the unique thing that I did is work 20 hours a day for 16 months. But I never got tired. One of the things that I felt very special about is that I used psychologists to assist in the selection of the jurors. We had 5 psychologists that were actually in the courtroom who would advise us with respect to the nonverbal communication of prospective jurors, and who kept us oriented to the fact that when you select a jury, you're selecting a group of people. So you have to look at how this group of people, the people who come into that group, may interact with each other. And by having that type of expertise and intelligence, we were able to select a jury in less than 3 weeks. We knew that we would never get a jury that would be pro Angela Davis, But our hope was to get a jury that would be objective and would weigh the evidence and listen to reason, and particularly reason argument. The other thing, and that practice, what we did in that case, spawned the industry now known as jury consultants. Before that, there were no jury consultants because we were so successful. The other thing that we did, we used perceptual psychologists to explain why eyewitness testimony is unreliable and shouldn't be trusted. Because in her case, there were approximately 12, maybe more, eyewitnesses who claimed that she was present at the courtroom in the courthouse rather, on various days prior to the incident.
Okay, I think let me ask you a couple of questions about H.Rap Brown. You represented him at some point. Tell us what you know about H.Rap Brown.
Well, H.Rap Brown is perhaps one of the most brilliant people in the civil rights movement, who was absolutely committed to the struggle. Whatever Rap said, he meant. And he was a very keen observer of the American scene. I don't know if people have seen his book or read his book, but I have a copy here. I'm not going to give it to you because it's priceless. It's Die Nigga Die. And the general theme is that in the direction in which the country was going at that time, there would soon only be a need for African Americans who were entertainers or sports figures.
Now he mentions you in that book, doesn't he?
Well, I think he does, and it's dedicated to me and William Kunstler and to William Murphy, an African American lawyer from Louisiana.
Now, on this point, what, in your opinion, based on your observations, is the difference today with respect to the types of organizations that we have pushing for civil rights, pushing for the advancement of our African American community, the people in our African American community, and that time when you defended so many very obviously strong and courageous brothers and sisters?
Well, I don't want to sound ignorant, but what organizations do we have pushing for African Americans today? If they're pushing, well, what is their push? What are they're demanding? We have an African American president, but what demands have we placed on the African American president? For full employment, for equalization of the school system. We have integrated schools here and there, but the majority of African American students go to segregated schools whose conditions are worse than they were in 1954. I mean, what organization is fighting for that? In the 60s, the 50s and 60s, the NAACP was militant. The National Urban League was militant.
But those organizations still exist.
They still exist, but the militancy is there. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was a new organization. It was militant. It was pushing for integration.
So what?
The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was there. CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, was there.
So what has happened to those groups that they are not as militant as they were at that time?
Well, some of the groups are not existent now.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things happened is that Dr. King was assassinated, and the groups really lost their voice and their direction.
Let me ask you this question, Mr. Moore. Given all those circumstances, what advice would you have for the youth today, in particular young African American males?
I would say, fool, go to school. You need to have education. Understand that white people and other groups are not smarter than we are. They're usually better educated. And that's an advantage that puts you behind the 8 ball at every stage of your life.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moore.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moore.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for viewing Community in Crisis. Thank Mr. Moore. Thank you for coming as being our guest. We look forward to bringing you other interesting guests in the future. And until that time, so long.